Today, we're at the Royal Navy's excellent Fleet Air Arm Museum. And starting in the car park here, you can see two anchors. These are from British Royal Navy aircraft carriers, HMS Eagle and HMS Ark Royal. Unfortunately, unlike the Americans, we cut up our aircraft carriers for scrap, so there is no aircraft carrier museum to go to like the USS Intrepid in New York. But Fleet Air Arm Museum is excellent. You can see here the majority of the building in this hangar. It's not the biggest aircraft museum you're going to visit, certainly not the smallest. It's probably a third of the size of RAF Hendon or Cosford, but it has a really excellent collection of Royal Navy aircraft. You might see Spitfires pretty much everywhere you go. Much as we love them, they're two a penny in museums. I think RAF Hendon has 3 of them and 1 outside. But here you're going to see a Seafire. Where else are you going to see a Seafire? And great collection of different generations of Harrier jump jets. We're making our way inside. This is a model of one of the first towing tugs. It was a very small aircraft carrier which had a platform for taking off, and that was about it. No lifts, no storage. It could do 1 aircraft at a time, and that's how naval aviation began. Then just at the front here we have a really good introduction that runs through the history, gives you a feeling for the 4 hangars you're going to be visiting, and they're all split thematically, so there's a very good explanation of what you're going to see in each hall and how they're linked together, along with a series of historic artifacts, pieces of memorabilia and clothing, medals, parts of aircraft. Excellent little collection. I'm not going to show you everything here because although, as I said, it's a smaller aircraft museum, it's by no means small. I spent a few hours here. But I remember coming here as a teenager and it stayed with me. So when I had the opportunity to pop in, I really enjoyed. I think we spent about 3 hours here. A lovely collection of headgear from the different generations. Here in this cabinet you can see First World War flying gear and the airmen who were on the boat. And the cabinet before that you could see a tricorn hat, which was actually a Second World War ceremonial helmet for a naval aviator. You're in hangar 1 with the short S-27 on the left. It's a replica of the first aircraft to take off from a deck. The instantly recognisable Supermarine Walrus seaplane. Series of Wessexes. Very interesting Sea King, which is painted in a half and half Royal Air Force and Navy scheme. I'll get to that in a while. Had a really good chat with one of the staff here. They were very well informed and very chatty. And he was able to take me through the whole history of some of these planes, which, in case you're bored by it, I won't give you, but I found it very interesting. So, taking a brief stroll around this hangar, there's a piece of an armoured car. You can see it's a fairly simple armoured car from the First World War era, which is used to defend airfields, along with this replica of the S-27, which took off from the model that we saw earlier on from that aircraft deck. Not really an aircraft carrier yet. Excellent collection of historical items and good explanations on the wall. Here you can sit in this wicker basket and wiggle the controls to sight the ground. And it's a beautiful replica. You could see it's a wooden frame. almost like the Wright Flyer, but just a couple of years later. And there you see a pusher propeller. I believe it was a Gnome rotary French engine with the wing at the front to help balance it. Again, very much like the early model. Beautiful reconstruction. I believe it's the only reconstruction. The other aircraft in the museum are real. And we're going to get to the helicopters you can see in the background shortly. But imagine flying in that. It's like flying a kite with a lawnmower tied to your back. I think I'd feel a lot safer in one of those paragliders than in this little wood wicker construction. Here's a Sopwith Baby. You might be familiar with the Sopwith Pop. You could say it's a smaller, younger cousin with these rockets on the wings and the floats. It actually is a real plane, but it's a composite of two. It's 8214 and 8215, but it's modelled as 8214 that was flown by Sub-Lieutenant Heinems, the Jabberwock. This is actually a derivation of the Sopwith Schneider. You might know the Schneider trophy. And it was a two-seater originally with normal commercial use, mainly sport. But it was modified for naval use as a single-seater with a Lewis gun firing through the propeller. And there's a good explanation of how that worked if you're not sure. You don't want to shoot the blades. Here's the only incomplete damaged one on full display. Sadly, it was destroyed during bombing by the Luftwaffe in the Second World War, but it's actually the original short type 184, often called the short 225, and it was the first plane to drop a torpedo and the first one to attack a ship. So it actually attacked a ship at the Battle of Jutland and was the only naval aviation anywhere in the First World War that actually saw service. So a really significant plane, unfortunately badly damaged. It's actually made from magnesium steel and spruce. It's the wonderful Supermarine Walrus with the wings folded back. This saw a lot of service with the Fleet Air Arm. It was often launched from ships. They would rotate out a launch, catapult it out from the side of a warship. But lovely plane. Originally it was called the Supermarine Seagull 5 before being changed to the Walrus. Very famous as a fleet spotter. This particular model was actually bought back from the Irish Navy after the war, because it really is a compulsory plane if you're going to have a collection of Fleet Air Arm aircraft. And you can see very well how the wings fold. When they fold back in, they're actually just clipped with a metal bracket, and it holds them in place firmly. A beautiful sheet metal construction with rivets, and you can really see it close up. It even has its own little anchor. Then right next to it is the very famous early search and rescue helicopter, the Westland WS-51 Dragonfly. Americans might recognize it as the Sikorsky S-51. Dragonfly was actually built by Westland Aircraft under license, so really it is the anglicised licensed version of the Sikorsky. But beautiful aircraft, great visibility from the front cockpit, and you can see the side door slides. There's a net at the back you can see, and that would be lowered down. That's how they could raise people, like an early version of what you'd see in a Sea King today. But a beautiful aircraft, very good example of early helicopters. A beautiful model of HMS 5, which it's a bit of a theme in this museum. Obviously, you can't put huge, great ships in here, but they have excellent scale models of them. And my only criticism would be they don't mention the scale, so it's hard to tell exactly. I would guess 100:1. Certainly not 72nd scale. Here's a beautiful Westland Wessex. It's the HAS 3 version, and it's actually part of the Falkland exhibition. It's called Humphrey. You can see what look like bullet holes marked with red there. It's actually shrapnel from when the ship, the Antrim, took a direct hit. A beautiful Wessex with a great history. It was used for a series of rescues and actually has a lot of markings by the door, which hopefully we capture when I walk back round. Humphrey's probably the most famous of the Wessexes. It was stationed aboard HMS Antrim, and it was taken to retake the South Georgia and the Falkland Islands. And 21st of April, it actually helped land special forces on Fortuna Glacier to observe Argentinian positions, before then continuing a series of rescue missions. And as a result, it has a very high tally of rescues. But unfortunately, it got hit by shrapnel, which severely damaged it. It's been patched up and repaired and maintained in the condition it was at the end of the Falkland. And here's another Wessex. This is actually the later model. It's the HU5, which was also used in the Falklands, and this is in commando colours. This aircraft was actually on the Atlantic Conveyor, which was sunk by an Exocet missile, and was used as a helicopter gunship. You can see there's a lot more space in this model. This is the last of the Westland helicopters to have a drive chain from the engines in the nose cone at the front, and the drive chain runs diagonally up through the body, which severely limits the space inside, but here there's a lot more space. The other Wessex had a radar position which took up 2 seats at the back, and that really meant very small corridor. In fact, the last flight out had 20 people on it, and they rescued 20 people, one of whom had to actually lay over the laps of the radar controllers because it was used often for anti-submarine operations. Here's the Westland Sea King. You can see the yellow RAF side, and there's also the red Royal Navy side. So this particular model, helicopter, was operated by both the Navy and the Air Force. And when this was retired, it was kept with the grey and red of the Royal Navy's rescue operations and the yellow on the other side of the RAFs. You'll see an all yellow model at RAF Hendon if you watch our video on that. And you can see here folded up, they very much showcase the way that aircraft are stowed on ships, because you often see aircraft just fully out with all their wings and tails in position. But when you're manhandling them on a small ship, you need to make more space. Here's the winch, and you can step inside, and at the back there's an interesting control panel section, and you can also go up to the cockpit and see how there's the radar and sonar operation. Because this is a naval model, you could actually lower a radar into the water and track submarines. It's really the only way to catch submarines underwater is to use what's called a dipping radar, which is actually in place. You can see it. Unfortunately, I don't think I captured the radar bell itself. And then down the corridor is the cockpit at the front. One of the things I really like at Yeovil is that you get very close access to the aircraft. Like here, you can walk through to the cockpit and see all of the controls, the yoke, the dozens of controls and dials. really get a feeling for exactly how it works. Along with the rather lack of creature comforts, you can just see a little sheepskin where cushion would be quite pleasant, but fascinating. And you have to think, how do you know which button to push? Clearly a lot of training. And if we turn around, we can actually see the drive shaft, which was one of the main limitations of the Wessex. It took up a lot of the cabin room because it comes up through here under this casing, like the drive shaft on a car, but from the turbine engine. And I believe this model had a turbine, whereas the other Wessex had a diesel. After this, the RAF and Royal Navy helicopters all had gas turbines because they require less maintenance and there are power advantages. And the engine can be at the top, so you don't have to have that drive shaft running through the middle. Now we're into the second hangar, and there's a display as we leave of 771 Squadron with the ace of clubs that you might have spotted on the last. Here in Hangar 2 we have this excellent fairy swordfish. It's a bit sad that it's posed up there where you can't get quite so close, but you can go up and walk around the back of one of the wings. And you can see it's a biplane targeting up on this U-boat conning tower, which you can go inside, and there's reconstruction of part of an old German submarine and some historical items. Pretty cramped, not a world away from some of the aircraft you're allowed to crawl inside. Here we have the Fairy Fulmer. Although we had 800 aircraft built, this is actually the prototype, and it's the very last Fairy Fulmer in the world. It famously acted as the spotter in the hunt for the Bismarck, which was completed by bombers with Fairy Swordfish. This was a spotter, long-range reconnaissance and light fighter, and as you can see, built specifically to fold to fit on boat. It was a decent plane in the early stages of the war, but when it went to the Far East, the Mitsubishi Zero Zen was just far too fast and capable. In fact, puzzled a lot of people until the Allies finally got hold of one and realised that there was no armour to protect the plane, and therefore the incredibly thin fuselage and wings was why it was so light and so fast. There's a bell here from HMS Ark Royal, the famous aircraft carrier which was sunk during the Second World War. Here we see the Fairy Fulmer from a different angle. Quite interesting detail of the interior of the wing. And a Grumman Martlet. It's a variant of the Grumman Wildcat. And there is actually a Grumman Wildcat here as well. Very recognisable, stubby little fighter that was American plane, hence the Pratt & Whitney radial engine. But you can see also served with the Royal Navy. It was brought in as a replacement for the Fairy Fulmer. The Fulmer had been a two-seater, but the performance disadvantage against single fighters, they moved over to a very different plane with the Wildcat, starting off with the Martlet variant. And you can see a lot of damage to the paint on it. Quite often you see them painted in pristine museum condition. When I see models which are hyper-realistic, I feel like they've overdone it with the little scratches to the aluminium. But walking around this museum and looking at the Wildcat as an example here, but quite a few, you get a feeling that probably normal military wear and tear, they are a little bit more rough than you normally see in museum condition or air shows. It's been very interesting here You can see where the wheels fold up into the front of the fuselage, how tight it is that effectively when they're down, there's a gap the whole way through the plane. Over to the side here is a North American Harvard. It was Harvard in British service, but it's often known as the T6 Texan in American service, and was used as a light trainer. It was built originally by Commonwealth aircraft, but moved over to North American. And a very long service. You normally see it in yellow for the RAF colours for a trainer. And if you see our video on RAF Hendon, there's an excellent T6 Harvard there. Very widely used by a lot of air forces as a really reliable trainer. In fact, in Korea and Vietnam, the Americans used them as forward control aircraft because of their near fighter-like performance. And here's an aircraft that was very hard to photograph because of where it's hung, but pretty unique. I've never seen one anywhere else, only 200 were ever built. It's actually not a helicopter, it's a rotor kite. It's a Fokker Angelis FA330, which is called a wagtail, a Backstelzer. And it's a type of fixed-wing rotary kite that was deployed from submarines. It was super small. You could bolt it together, put the pilot in that tiny little seat, and they could fly up and they could spot. So it was used for spotting from submarine. Basically towed from a submarine. So two people would deploy it, pilot gets in it, cable is reeled out, and actually the movement of the airflow on the rotors from the boat is what would spin them. So it really is a kite and not a real plane. But they got a view of 25 nautical miles, 46 kilometres from them. And here's the promised view of the upstairs of the Fairey Swordfish. Very famous British aircraft, which was instrumental against the Tirpitz and the Bismarck. Well, more the Bismarck. The Tirpitz I would put down more to the Gladiators, or specifically the Sea Gladiator, which we'll be seeing in a little while. Somewhat hidden away up here is underwater diorama with parts from a skua, because the skuas were almost entirely lost, and they found some that had been sunk during battle and took the parts, brought them here, and actually helped to reconstruct the only skua that's still around. And this just gives you a feel for digging them out of underwater and the diving equipment used. And these are original parts that were sort of cobbled together to produce the reconstruction. Blackbird Skua was raised from a Norwegian fjord in 1974. Making our way back downstairs because we're fairly limited on time. You can see the Corsair in the background there, and here's the Wildcat. Or Martlet, I keep thinking Wildcat for this one. And over here, really great collection of beautiful, excellently made models of Royal Naval ships. There's the Ark Royal, there's a series of battleships and cruisers as well, but really beautiful model there. And you can see there, that's the Seafires, which we'll be seeing one of in a little while, I promise. But beautiful. Showing back the reflections, really excellent model. And you can see already evolving the shape of a modern carrier. The majority of carriers are now islands to the side with straightforward runway. Only really those with ski jumps at the front for shorter ones. And there's also the variations that the Americans have two bisecting runways on their supercarriers. And here the iconic Corsair. nearly always seen with its wings bent if it's not in flight. When they're laid out, they actually have a camber. They go down and then back up again, almost like a bird's wing in flight. It's sort of a shame that it's built, it's positioned. You can see it. You can see how the wing goes down and then flattens out. But it's a very unusual wing shape, which is instantly recognizable as a Corsair. Just like this very aggressive front on this long plane, instantly recognizable as a Grumman Avenger. Grumman Avenger TBM-3E was the main model. But this is the Royal Naval version, and you might spot, if we look forward, a little bit of a difference from the American ones that you normally see. And this is a one-seater, and you normally have a second seat with a gun turret from a bomber. But that's actually the F&E variants. The base TBM didn't have that. But a very striking aircraft, certainly very aggressive looking from the front. And a very different design philosophy in the American planes of the era, like the Corsair, the Wildcat, the Avenger. In it, they used radial engines, so they had a very rounded front. Whereas we moved a lot in Britain towards the Merlin, which was an inline engine. So you get a very different, more streamlined, less in-your-face front to the British planes of the era. Here an interesting wooden torpedo. So rather than wasting real torpedoes on training sessions, they used a wooden torpedo like that, and that's a real one that's been fired. Here a de Havilland Vampire below. You can see the MiG-15 in the corner there. And another HR-5 Dragonfly, which we already saw in the last hole. And here you can see the Vampire. It's actually a Sea Vampire. Very slight modification to make it lighter for landing. And if you look closely, in between the twin booms, when I put the camera down, you can see an arrestor hook that can be released from behind the main body. Interestingly, the pitot tubes are at the back of the plane here. And you can see the weights to help control the rear rudder and aileron, which you don't see so much today with hydraulics. But beautiful little Vampire. And after the Dragonfly, there's a beautiful model, an aircraft carrier there, an ejector seat, and a MiG-15. Now it's painted in North Korean colours to represent the MiG-15s that we fought in the Korean War. But actually this is a Polish MiG. It's Migovi and Gerevich. They were the standard Soviet fighter jet for Russia, Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, and widely used. So this actually would have been a Millet Slim 2 PZL, which was a variant of the 15. I believe it's the BIS. Over here we have another Sea Venom, but this is a trainer variant. It's a side by side, it's just the cockpit. You can climb in, we'll go in a second when the people are out of it. But there's a lineup of some of the engines. You can see the rotary engines that were very popular, the Gypsy D8 there, and the ever famous Merlin, Rolls-Royce Merlin, pretty much the engine of choice during the Second World War for the British. An interesting collection here. And now we'll just make our way over to the Vampire as it's coming through. It's a very popular exhibit. Because somewhat unusually, you can actually climb inside it. And it's quite cramped, but there is space for two people. And what's really striking when you climb inside is the seats are more comfortable than they look. And the view through the front is minuscule. It's like looking through a visor on a motorbike helmet or when you're leaning forward. You see there, I'm quite tall. There's not much visibility out of the front there. And you can see all the different controls. Someone's disconnected the wires, which is a little bit worrying. But obviously, all these exhibition aircraft at museums, they got them. They tend to have a lot of parts taken out. They almost all have the engines removed, and any electronics that can be used in other aircraft, they're not ready to fly. Famously, the Black Buck raids on the Falklands, they were actually had to go to one of the museums, I believe it was Duxford or Cosford, and get the refueling probe from one of them so that they could actually carry out the long distance raid that required a lot of refueling. There's a lot of really great exhibits on the walls and interesting historical items, but we'll just take a quick glance around the hangar as we head towards hangar 3, which you enter through a helicopter and then a sort of helicopter themed tunnel. So you then emerge from the same Wessex helicopter here, which is built into the wall, and now you're on the flight deck. So the flight deck here, you've got a beautiful collection of aircraft from Royal Navy history. Sopwith Putt biplane, the Supermarine Seafire, rather odd Westland Wyvern, Westland more famous for the helicopter. The Supermarine here is actually a Supermarine attacker. Not the Supermarine Swift as you might think. Here a Sea Vixen and a Buccaneer. And in the background you can see what's been beautifully mocked up as the control towers of an aircraft carrier. And there's also some, as well as the island there, there's a ski jump, there's runway markings. Here you've got the Harrier jump jet and the Phantom. And we're going to be seeing more Harriers in a little while. Continuing with the beautiful collection of scale models of ships, there's HMS Ark Royal. Here you can see with the Buccaneers, a very good Buccaneer there. We're going to make our way upstairs to the control towers. So modern aircraft carrier has either one combined or two separate. The Royal Navy have now moved to two separate. This is constructed from pieces and items from within real British aircraft carriers. So it gives you a very good feel of the key rooms in the two towers at the side to control flight operations and to control the actual ship. And the captain generally sits in the flight operations deck during a battle. And there you have British ships that have carried aircraft. First one in the background, you might see the Dazzle camouflage. That's from the First World War. Here from the Falklands with a series of the Wessexes that we saw earlier and some landing craft. Really stunning detail. Really beautiful ship. This is the HMS Ark Royal, I think the fourth one to carry the name, the RO7. It was the last of the Invincible class carriers. And very instrumental in the Falklands War. So interestingly, the ship is, I believe, from slightly earlier, because if you look at the camouflage on the Wessexes and the Sioux helicopter at the back, and also the choice of scout plane at the front, they're not really Falklands era. That's much earlier, maybe Malay or the Aden crisis. And here, Second World War, you can see the Berry Swordfish 2. And interestingly, you see a lift there for the first time. Now here, very much a more recent, you can see the ski jump and you can see Sea Kings being used. The ski jump's used to help with the short takeoff of fighters, particularly the Harrier jump jet. Although the Harrier jump jet can do VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing, it can also do short takeoff and landing. And the ski jump at the front allows for a more reasonable sized ship. We don't really have the budget that the Americans have for their aircraft carriers. Here you see Sea Vixens and much earlier Wessexes, more kind of 1960s. Beautiful models, really stunning detail and attention, and I presume accuracy. This is on the first level with other exhibits that I didn't video. But if we head up the stairs here, we get through to the main tower of what you think of as an aircraft carrier, where you come through this door that's nicely dressed up as a hatch. And out you come onto the main deck, and you can see the hangar deck, and that's beautifully reconstructed here. Gives you a great idea of the very busy operations of an aircraft carrier. Throughout this section, there's very good explanation. There's a nicely marked route. There's two routes, one if you're mobile and one if you're not, with stairs. You see all the little details. The phone for the flight controller. And here's the sub-citadel. And you can see where they control operation. And it's all very well explained. The sort of, not holographic, but a glass sheet with a projection within it of someone who's served on that type of ship, explaining roughly what happens in that room, why it's darkened, why they wear the clothes they do. So we'll see in a minute when you go into the operations control. It's controlling the whole theatre of war around the aircraft carrier, and they always wear these funny fire overalls. I never quite understood, because why would there be a fire? But obviously it's for when there's a military operation and there's an assumption there may be a fire. Here's the explanation of exactly what's going on there. And this is where they control, particularly the ship's bridge. You can see where they're going, radars, locating other ships and such. But it's very much passed out. So there's 3 rooms which are now split across 2 towers. One to control where the ship's going and what else is around it. One to control the takeoff and landing, almost like a flight traffic control, FTC. And one to control the actual theatre of war and attacks. And then here's the NAFI, where they would eat. You can see a sort of reconstruction of what's basically a cafe. And behind there, they're making bread, food, serving it out here. And then down this beautifully reconstructed, really feels like you're on a swaying ship at sea with all of the controls. Here's a briefing room. This is from Ark Royal. There's actually one briefing room for each squadron and then one main briefing room so that you can brief more complicated operations. You can see that pilot at the front's been watching Top Gun, so he's got that Tom Cruise hands on the back of the head arrogant pose while he's being told exactly where to fly and what to do. Not the most exciting of rooms, not quite like it is in Hollywood, but this is where major flight operations and attacks are planned from a British aircraft carrier. No doubt it's a bit more sophisticated in today's day and age with our latest aircraft carriers. And then just down the corridor is the air traffic control, which is very similar to an air traffic control at an airport. There's a little model on the wall where they put the aircraft to show where they are on the deck so that they can coordinate what aircraft are in the air, what's landing, what's taking off. The aircraft control room here, ACR, which is basically like flight traffic control with less electronics in this instance, a lot more paper scheduling. There you can see the panel where they control what aircraft to wear on the flight line. Because you've got a limited space, imagine with a great big runway on an airport, you might have 2 or 3 runways and a dozen taxiways and parking ways. You don't have that luxury in this contained space, yet you need to take off and land substantially. Is where the captain spends most of his time during action. It's a very darkened room with a lot of lit buttons. And you'll see they're wearing those fireproof overalls, the hoods and gloves, which is specifically in case of fire. The captain there explaining exactly what he does and how he controls operations from here. The actual sailing of the ship is much more delegated, and it appears he doesn't get involved with that during an operation. But very hard to see on video, very interesting room. See the luxurious accommodation for sailors on board. And a lot of explanations of the wall, captain's cabin, nothing in there. Escape hatch for getting outside of the boat. A lot of different parts of aircraft carriers to give you the feeling of that. And then this is the deck operations, I believe. Really get the feeling for how it's a coordinated chaos between very different, clearly defined roles, where each member of that chain has to know what their role is, know what their place is, and trust that other people are going to be doing their role. It was very fascinating walking around. And then downstairs there's a room with explanation of the flight deck and 2 models of the Queen Elizabeth II aircraft carrier. There's the one with the ski jump at the front and the one with the 2 runways. And apparently it was constructed in such a way that it can be modified in future if needs be. But we went with this configuration with the F-22s, and there is a large model of an F-22, not an actual full-size one, which if you see my video of RAF Hendon, they have an excellent F-22 reconstruction. But this is the Navy's, and the Navy has the VTOL STOL version with much more manoeuvrability that was made for the Marines. You can identify it by the panels on the top, which open with the fans to allow it to do vertical takeoff and very responsive maneuvering. If you watch the film Die Hard 4, there's a very good scene with the F-22 where it does some ridiculously aerobatic moves. And there it's because of that panel there where it can funnel air through the top, the bottom of the aircraft and basically hover and rotate. And yes, it was CGI. Well worth a look at the carrier strike group. Good explanation of the different ships that make it up and their role. I love how the submarine is just a sign, no submarine. And through to Hangar 4, where they're fixing up an old skewer from a lot of different parts, and I've got to say there's not much to see, but the aircraft nerds are very excited about it. I'm quite an aircraft nerd. I wasn't that excited. In the background you might make out the Concorde. It's instantly recognisable, but what's wrong with it? It doesn't quite look like a Concorde, other than the fact that it doesn't have British Airways or Air France livery. It's not quite long enough, is it? So this is prototype 2, and it is effectively a Concorde, but it's a shorter length. It's about 20 foot shorter than the real one. Here's a bunch of deck hooks for the Barracuda there. They're rebuilding, Barracuda, not Skewer. I'm sure you'll recognise the engine from Harrier Jump Jet with the vectored thrust there. If you've stuck around for 44 minutes, then I'm sure you like aircraft. And to the right there is this is the prototype engine, slightly earlier version. And here's the first flying prototype of the Harrier jump jet actually started off with this. There's a model here. It's in the Science Museum if you watch our video on that. And it used pipes for the vectored thrust. It was called the Flying Bedstead. It's hanging on the wall at the end of the flight gallery at the Science Museum in our first video. And then they had a next prototype that had pipes as well, like that model. And they moved to the first version of the Harrier jump jet here. You can see the markings, the black and white circle testing. Very interesting example, and I'm not sure where else you can find a prototype Harrier. At the other end of the hangar, they have more recent Harrier jump jets, and it's fascinating to see how they've grown in terms of size and how the aerodynamics have modified. It's actually pretty tricky to move from vectored thrust forward to vectored thrust descending, and there's a little demonstration here where you can tweak with the forward speed, backward speed, up and down yawing, and you can try and make it land on the number 4, which is possible. I did manage it, but it's not as easy as it looks. And to the right here, the blue plane is the BAC-221, I believe the only one in the world. It was built as part of the Concorde program, specifically to test the Yeovil Delta wing, and you can see a test model underneath from the air tunnel testing. Here's a GR3, a more recent Falklands era Harrier jump jet. In the background there is Westland Sea King HC4. But I've always liked the Harrier jump jet, and it's lovely to see 3 of them in the same room. I promise you're going to see a GR9 in a minute on a ski jump. But there in the background, Wessex with Sea Skua missiles. This is probably the helicopter I associate most with the Navy over the last few decades. And there's a beautiful model next to it of one of the aircraft carriers with the ski jump it flew from, along with the Harrier. Try to get a little shot of. A lot of information on the wall. And there's actually an opening where you can go and view the live runway, the taxiway. But being the weekend, and frankly, they don't run secret operations from right next to a museum, there really wasn't much to see. You see there is a icebreaker and several of the destroyers and aircraft carriers. Is the Harrier jump jet on a ski jump as though it's about to launch off the prow of the boat. This is part of the Falklands exhibition where there's a lot of detail of ships and aircraft that served in the Falklands, where really the Fleet Air Arm was quite instrumental in projecting power and returning the Falklands. Now we're going to head over to Concorde. So you can see different markings to the commercial version of Concorde, and you do straight away see it's a little bit smaller. But we're going to access through the rear tail door, walk through it, and then you come out at the front through the normal boarding door, and that takes you up to a gantry that runs the whole way round the hangar. Probably won't show you too much from up there because I think there's a limit to how long you want to watch about the Fleet Air Arm Museum. But hopefully you get that it's a very interesting museum if you like aircraft. We're heading up to the main passenger area of Concorde. You can see here a lot of exposed fuselage, which you wouldn't normally see on a passenger plane. And straight away you see not that many seats. So one side's open for you to walk through. One side has the standard seating configuration. And then there's a series of computers, effectively, 1970s computers, which you wouldn't see on a normal passenger plane. And these are for monitoring every aspect of the plane as it's flying. If you've ever watched a airliner doing a test flight. It has a huge amount of electronics on board so that they can collect tons of information about how the plane is behaving and really understand its performance in every aspect, which is why the test process takes so long. They also carry a different air supply, and you can see there all the cables, huge amount of high capacity cables and all the different dials. There would have been seats down here so that engineers could sit and monitor the flight. It's a lot more than a normal flight where you're just monitoring the general performance of the plane. You're actually validating the safety of the plane. Here's the cockpit. The glass doesn't really help, but it's a beautiful cockpit. A lot going on. And try to get a bit of a view of it. But really, it's quite difficult. You have to come and see it. Then we're going to head out and look around the last little bit of the museum. Here we are outside the Concorde 02, so it's the first British-made Concorde. And you can see here the front nose, which drops down famously, the drooping nose for takeoff to increase the view out of the front. Because if you look from inside, it's a very slim angle. You don't really see anything except sky, so that would drop down. And we head along here, you can see the Harrier jump jet. This is the FRS-1. It's part of the Falklands exhibition. It was the second member of the Harrier family, served with the Royal Navy and served with distinction in the Falklands and also the Falklands conflict. Funnily enough, there were attempts to sell the Sea Harrier to Argentina, so we very nearly had a Harrier versus Harrier conflict. In the background, you can see the GR9 Harrier and the Sea King. Really very large collection of Harriers here. And this is the last hangar. So hopefully you've enjoyed our tour of the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Yeovil. I certainly did. And if you've reached this point, then you probably like aircraft. So you probably did as well. But please do like and subscribe. Check out the video on RAF Hendon. It has a great collection of aircraft. And we'll be back next weekend with an Unbound History. And on Monday with a Monday Museum tour. So please do like and subscribe and see you again soon.